Good evening, Rick.
Hello, Peter. How you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine. All right, if we could have some of the rest of our team on, just kind of give us a thumbs up that we are good and streaming. I will kick things off. We're good? Oh, perfect. All right. I'm Representative Peter Meijer, representing Michigan's 3rd Congressional District. To all the West Michiganders who are joining us tonight, thank you so much for your time. This will be our first town hall. This is something that we had hoped to do earlier, and frankly, I think the beginning of this term has presented many unforeseen difficulties. We certainly didn't anticipate that we would have to evacuate on the 3rd day that we had in office. Before IT was able to set up our call forwarding, same for many of the freshmen. Before the back-end GPS kind of confirmation system that makes sure that emails being sent are from folks within the district, before that was able to be set up by our IT provider. So we're still in the process of finalizing all that. As you can imagine, the Capitol is on a pretty strong lockdown. It's a walled off city right now, and we're still dealing with the after effects of what happened 4 weeks ago. So I just thank everyone for joining us here tonight. I am joined by our district director, Rick Truer. I'll let Rick introduce himself briefly.
Good evening, everyone. Hi, my name is Rick Truer, and I do serve the 3rd Congressional District as Congressman Meyer's District Director. And we're pleased to welcome everyone to the Zoom call, as well as everyone watching on Facebook.
Thank you so much. Before we begin, I just want to offer a brief legislative update, and then we will go to the town hall portion discussing Q&A. So we received our final committee assignments, and I'm pleased to say that I sit on 3 different committees: on Homeland Security, Foreign Affairs, and Science, Space, and Technology. I'm especially proud to say that on the Homeland Security Committee, I am the ranking Republican, so the highest ranking Republican on the subcommittee that deals with oversight, management, and accountability. Now, this is going to be a very critical committee going forward, especially as we deal with not only issues around domestic security, issues around the border, and around the overall security picture and management, but also to ensure that as the Biden administration moves forward, that we have strong and strenuous oversight of their activities around Homeland Security more broadly. We also had a vote tonight on budget reconciliation. So budget reconciliation is a process whereby a legislative item can get passed in the Senate with only a 50+1 vote threshold. Normally, under something called the filibuster, you have to have 60 votes in order to pass a piece of legislation. But the budget reconciliation allows for a simple majority in both the House and the Senate. Now, unfortunately, Republicans are in the minority in the House. And we also, by the slimmest of votes, are in the minority in the Senate. So the understanding is that this budget reconciliation maneuver, which I voted no on, will be used by Speaker Pelosi, by Leader Schumer in the Senate, and the Biden administration in order to push through legislation with no need for any bipartisan input, no need for any negotiations, but essentially one-party rule. So it's a frustrating circumstance, and I'm disappointed that the initial inaugural speech talking about unity, the speech talking about the desire to work across the aisle and heal divisions, that we are not seeing that borne out in legislative items, and specifically this budget reconciliation flies in the face of that. My overall priorities stay the same, however. I campaigned on the need to end our endless wars, and I'm proud that in the Foreign Affairs Committee, we will be looking to repeal or add a sunset to the authorizations for the use of military force that were passed in the wake of 9/11 that have been the justification for continuing our conflicts. Those have gone on for far too long without any substantial legislative input, but essentially a delegation of Congress's war powers to the president and to the executive branch. And I think it's time that we end that precedent and have a discussion about what our foreign policy and status of force abroad should look like once and for all. Also, when it comes to issues around restoring confidence in our electoral system, that's something that we are working on in a bipartisan manner. I'm pleased to say that I'm on the Problem Solvers Caucus, which is a group of 56 members of Congress, 28 Republicans and 28 Democrats that resolved to look for bipartisan solutions on the issues where there can be bipartisan solutions. I think especially around election integrity and confidence in our electoral system, we saw bipartisan commissions in 2001 after the 2000 elections, in 2005 after the 2004 elections, and those were the Carter-Ford and Baker-Carter commissions respectively. And we really haven't had that similar top-level bipartisan commission to suggest best practices, to examine how states are conducting their voting systems and offer better solutions where they exist. So that's something we're looking to reprise again, to restore faith and confidence in our electoral system. More broadly, I'm also part of the PFAS task force. That's an important bipartisan group looking at PFAS, PFOS, and PFOA contamination of our waterways, which is something that's very near and important to those in West Michigan, especially those in the Rockford area and in some communities around Battle Creek, but also in Ionia and Barry, where there's additional PFAS contamination. So on a lot of these priorities, I think there's strong opportunities to push through, even though being in the minority, even though being in a position where, as with budget reconciliation, the Democrats essentially are saying they can go it alone. But that's not going to stop me from wanting to push forward on some of these priorities that were discussed throughout the campaign. And then just in general, working to promote limited government, promote economic freedom, and promote individual liberty, the core conservative foundational principles that we must protect. We must look for solutions that are based on that foundation. And whenever that opportunity presents itself, we'll be fighting hard on that. So that's the brief legislative update. And now I guess we can briefly discuss a little bit of the ground rules when we go into the Q&A portion. Rick.
Yeah, great. And I'll just sort of give a couple explanations for that. So while your DC office focuses mainly on legislation and policy issues, we also want people to know that the district office is committed to providing excellent constituent services to the residents of the district. And tonight we're going to be focusing on answering a lot of those policies and legislative questions. But if you have questions that are personal in nature or pertain to a problem or issue that you're having personally with a federal agency, we encourage you to go and submit those on the Congressman's website. If you go to meijer.house.gov, click on the services drop-down menu and then click on help with a federal agency. You can complete a form there and a member of Congressman Meier's staff will be in touch with you to help respond to your concerns. And besides working on constituent services, we also work with connecting with groups, doing outreach, reaching out to organizations and businesses in the district that want to highlight federal issues that they're facing or celebrate a success that they recently had. For tonight, if you want to participate by asking a question, we ask that you be ready to come on question and ask that question in person. We're anticipating that there are going to be a great many questions. There's already several filling the Q&A box for us. So you can submit those questions in the Q&A section on the bottom of the Zoom bar. In your question, if you could please put your full name, if it's not your screen name, and also where in the district you're calling from. We want to kind of know where people are living. And once your questions have been submitted, we will start by introducing you by name, and then our team will then unmute you and bring you on screen so that you can ask the congressman your question. If you submit a question in the Q&A box, you may get a notice that your question's been dismissed. That is just actually a process that we're using to help us sort through them. And so we're adding those questions to the queue of questions that will actually be asked. So if your question has been dismissed, please prepare to be on screen. And if your question is deleted, it's because we have similar questions already being asked and someone else will be brought on screen to ask that question. So please keep your questions succinct and as brief as possible so that Congressman Meijer can respond to as many concerns as possible, and make sure that your comments take the form of a question and not simply a statement. So if you are ready, Congressman, we will start getting to some of the questions.
Yes, and let me first begin with just an overall explanation of how we arrived at this point. And I know there's one person who mentioned they might not be able to make this full call. This is also being, in addition to the Zoom that we have, it's being live streamed on Facebook. And at the conclusion, it will remain up on Facebook for those who wish to review it, who wish to watch or otherwise share. So this is not going to disappear. This is something that I want to ensure is available for folks to better understand who are interested in understanding how I arrived at these decisions and also the answers to some of these questions. And as Rick mentioned, there will be some questions that have been asked in similar variations by multiple individuals. We obviously want to get to as many questions as possible, but without becoming redundant. So we may be consolidating some questions that folks have asked into the most common form. So with that, I'm sitting in my office right now in the Longworth House office building. 4 weeks ago, I was actually right here after 4 hours in a Ways and Means Committee hearing room. And let me just walk up what happened leading up to the 6th. So on Sunday, January 3rd, we were sworn in. It became very evident that there would be challenges to the electoral certification process. Now, Congress's role in certifying elections is what some scholars call ministerial. There have been objections raised in the past. A single House Democrat attempted to do it in 2017 after the 2016 election. But what happens is if you have a senator and a member of Congress that raise an objection, the House will discuss for 2 hours and then will vote on whether or not to accept or reject that objection. This hadn't happened in 2004. There was 2005, after the 2004 elections, there had been an objection that was raised in the House and then had a Senator Barbara Boxer, a Democrat from California, that signed on as well. But in those instances, there had been no issues around any questions around the validity of the election. It was merely a way of bringing attention to a perceived issue, giving a reason for both the Senate and folks in the House who wanted to speak to talk for 2 hours. Unfortunately, leading up to January 6th, the day we do our electoral college certification, that was not the narrative that was being presented. The narrative was that this was a day to stop the steal. Despite Republicans holding a minority in the House, and even if every Republican had operated in lockstep, that would not have happened. There would not have been an overturning of the Electoral College. Every state legislature sent a single slate of electors to the Congress to be certified. But again, that was not the narrative that was being given. I was in my office watching the speech that the president gave at the Ellipse. I had obviously been aware of the president's tweets leading up to that day, and consistently since November 3rd, he had been emphasizing that November 3rd was a landslide victory for Donald Trump, and that landslide victory had been stolen. And I phrase that using the president's words because I think it's important that we don't confuse issues around ensuring confidence in the elections with the false idea that there had been a massive flipping of votes. I had also seen discussions that not only was November 3rd a day when an election was stolen, but January 6th was a day to stop that steal. That fundamentally misread what Congress's role is. It was not only wrong in a statutory and constitutional frame, but it was frankly dangerous. The Electoral College, which is what we were certifying the results of, the Electoral College has been a foundational part of our election system. And this attempt to use that as a mechanism to overturn would have had incredibly dangerous consequences. But nonetheless, that was what was happening leading up to January 6th. We were expecting a large rally. And I use rally in an intentional way, because I know folks who came here for that rally. And I know they viewed it as an opportunity to have their voices be heard, as an opportunity to kind of celebrate the president. They came here peacefully. They came here with every expectation that this would be similar to one of the president's many rallies, which were very, largely positive celebratory events. But it was the thread of individuals who, and then we saw a darker strain too. And I'll kind of get to that in a minute. But after the president's speech, I made my way over to the House. That was when, in a joint session, senators and members of Congress joined together to go over the Electoral College. That's when the vice president opens up each state's envelope that contains the results of their Electoral College and reads that. And then, if there are no challenges, affirms it. There had been just a very bizarre idea that the vice president could somehow just accept or reject as he wished. I think some on the far corners called it a Pence card. That ultimately was not only just fanciful, but something that Vice President Pence, somebody who is a strong believer in the Constitution and rule of law, dismissed as not what the role that he had was. So I was on the House floor. We had the first objection to the state of Arizona, and we had moved up to the House gallery. We were being told that we had to stay away from the windows if we were to go outside, because there were reports that the protest was growing a little bit more rowdy, that it was growing in size and in number, and the police were worried about a confrontation. After about a half an hour after that warning, they started to seal the chamber. We were notified that there had been individuals who had made it into the Capitol. We've seen some of the videos that came out after, but at that point, all we knew is that folks had gotten into the Capitol. We thought it was a small group. We thought they'd be apprehended very quickly. We were then informed that tear gas had been deployed in the Capitol. We were told to take inhalation hoods that are meant in case there's a fire or smoke, and get those out and get ready to put them on. When we heard banging and thought it was doors being secured, we didn't realize that it was folks trying to break in into the House chambers. At that point, we were told to get down underneath our chairs. The chairs there are bulletproof because there had already been tear gas deployed. There had already been police officers being assaulted, and there was concern that individuals with weapons may start firing into the House chamber. The last thing was just being forced out, police officers escorting us under gunpoint to elevators, pushing an elevator button. We go down to sub-basements. We're wandering through tunnels, knowing that one of the House office buildings we're walking towards had already been evacuated, knowing that there had been pipe bombs that had been found around that location, not knowing if our colleagues were killed or injured or missing. We ended up staying in a committee hearing room for several hours with police outside the door as we kind of grappled with everything that was happening. And as that occurred, I remember the only message I saw, and this was right after we were evacuated from the House chamber, was the only message that I saw from the president was him attacking Mike Pence and criticizing Mike Pence, criticizing the vice president, questioning his courage, questioning his patriotism for not just waving a magic wand and overturning the election somehow. But in the moment, I thought, okay, well, that maybe the president isn't seeing what's happening on TV. We waited. I think it was 4:17 p.m. when the president finally put out a video. I can tell you that was close to 2.5 hours after we had fled the House chambers. It was after we knew that a woman had been shot and killed. It was after we knew that dozens of Capitol police officers had been injured. And unfortunately, one of them, Officer Brian Sicknick, who was beaten to death with a fire extinguisher. He was still in the hospital then and wouldn't pass for another day. We actually had his memorial service in the rotunda today. And I remember thinking, the person who can stop this, the person who can put an end to this is Donald Trump. It's President Trump. And I didn't understand what took him so long. I didn't understand why he didn't react. And when I saw the video that he put out at 4:17, it hit me like a ton of bricks. The video, he said, eventually got to the point of saying, go home. But it was, he reaffirmed it was a stolen election. He reaffirmed and celebrated, those who had shown up, making no distinction between, those who had committed awful acts of violence, and those who had otherwise been doing who had been there peacefully, right? I mean, this was a moment when, this was a moment when we needed leadership, and the president, in my view, did not show that. Now, we ultimately, it became clear that Nancy Pelosi was going to have a vote on impeachment. We did everything we could to try to not have that vote come. I would have vastly preferred that we had a different timeline. I would have preferred there was a different course. But when it was clear that that was going to be the case, I wanted to make sure that I spent every resource and every effort, best understanding this situation. One thing that's important to know is that impeachment has two different components. The House has a role to review the articles. In this case, it was a single article, but the articles of impeachment, and then decide if those articles are accurate. And then the trial is conducted in the Senate. I reviewed that article. The accusation, the allegation in that article of impeachment was incitement of insurrection. It cited the speech that the president gave at the Ellipse. It also referenced those two significant falsehoods, the two lies that led to the violence on the Capitol that day. One, landslide stolen election, November 3rd, and two, January 6th is the day to stop that steal. I grappled with the timing. I know some folks take issue and say that there wasn't due process. Well, let's talk about due process. Due process under the 5th and the 14th Amendments puts restrictions and protections for any American before the government can deny you of life, of liberty, so put you in jail, or of property. Life, liberty, property. In this case, and folks say, well, you didn't have any witnesses. Where was your evidence? The Capitol was the crime scene. We had all seen what had occurred before. We had seen what occurred that day. The members of Congress were folks who were impacted by this. We were there when it happened. So there was no question on how the events unfolded. Was this a fast process? It was. Would I have preferred a longer investigation? I will. That will occur. But at the end of the day, impeachment is a political decision. It's a political process. It is the one means by which Congress can tell an executive that this action is unacceptable, that this what occurred should not be tolerated. And when I think of Officer Sicknick, when I think of the 140 members of law enforcement who were sent to the hospital, when I think of the other 4 Americans who died that day, of the police officers who were at that event, who have since committed suicide, of the tragedy that has occurred, not to mention the attempt to override, the attempt to interfere, the attempt to destroy our constitutional process. Impeachment is an incredibly significant and serious act, but what we witnessed at the Capitol, the attempted insurrection, the involvement of a sitting American president and propagating the falsehoods that led up to that, required a significant response. And so that is why I ultimately arrived at the decision to impeach. And now, Rick, I know we're running a little bit behind on time. I just wanted to share that. And when I mentioned that feeling that when watching the president's video at 4:17 p.m. on January 6th, hitting me like a ton of bricks, all I could think about was that every accomplishment over the previous 4 years, the Middle East peace deals, a revitalized economy, wage growth for folks at every level, criminal justice reform, putting an end to endless wars, all of those accomplishments erased. The images on that screen, everything that had led up to it, to me was a betrayal of the accomplishments that had been made and required, honestly, just a vote to say that we cannot resort to political violence. We cannot tolerate it. I don't tolerate it on the left. And some have said, well, what about BLM? And we need to say that when it comes to the processing of our constitutional responsibilities, that we let nothing stand in the way of our oaths of office and our duty to the Constitution. And with that, I'm going to take a drink of water. Rick, please set us to the next question.
Right. Well, we're going to actually start with Cindy Whitkey. So Cindy, if you could get ready to turn on your camera and unmute yourself, we'll have you ask the first question, which has to do with impeachment for Congressman Meijer. So Cindy, welcome to the town hall.
Hi, thank you. I am very disappointed, and I just want to ask a question.
Please.
I just want to ask a question. Why aren't you doing what your constituents wanted you to do?
Thank you for that, Cindy. The fact that many, now we can see you visually. Okay, thank you, Cindy. The fact that this would disappoint many constituents was something that I took very seriously. There's a reason why I just, knowing that this was a vote, I had to take made me heartsick. But you raise a very good point, which is the responsibility of a member of Congress. Is it to reflect what may be, and I haven't polled the district on this. I obviously know that many of my supporters, many Republicans in the district, and to your point, probably a majority, maybe a strong majority, feel as you do, feel disappointed and feel that this was not a vote that I should have cast. That weighed on me. That is one of the reasons why I felt ultimately sickened by having to take this vote. The question is, should I be taking that poll? Should I be trying to say, well, what is the majority of folks in my district? What do they feel I should do at this moment in time? Or how do I balance that immediate feeling with what we need to do as a country, what I feel my party needs to do, and where I hope we can go? So I don't know that there's an answer to that. It's something that I think, please, can we unmute Cindy real quick?
I just have one thing to say.
Mm-hmm.
I listened to Trump's speech, and I do not believe he incited that. And I've also heard about the FBI knew about some of these things. I think what happened at the Capitol is horrible, but I don't think you reacted in the right time. I do think you should have maybe reread his speech, maybe listened to what the FBI had to say, and listen to your constituents. You know what? I went against people who told me not to vote for you because I believed in you, and I've lost that belief.
Well, and that is something that deeply weighs on me. And let me quickly address 2 points that you raised. One, and this is something many folks have pointed to. The president did say, march peacefully to the Capitol. To your point, he was also talking about fighting like hell. He had also been talking and saying things before that this is the day that this can change. The reason why the notion of stop the steal. Well, how do you stop the steal? It's probably not just showing up. And there were plenty of folks who were arrested in the Capitol. Over 800 got in. There were folks who were chanting, hang Mike Pence. They had erected a gallows outside. And to your point, this was not something that just the president gave a speech and all of a sudden things happened. right? Some folks are referencing the fact the pipe bombs that were put outside the Republican National Committee, the Democratic National Committee, those were placed the day before. The incitement, while it was capped off with that speech, it had been building in the culmination of those two fundamental lies. That one, November 3rd was a landslide victory for Donald Trump that was stolen. And two, that January 6th was the day to stop that steal. Because while the folks who broke into the Capitol and who were arrested are not representative of supporters of the president, the overwhelming majority, over 95% of them, did support the president. And many of those who were arrested said, we thought this is what he wanted us to do. And now the federal investigation will determine criminal liability. But when it comes to a president, when it comes to a leader, maybe this is my experience in the military, but I think we should be holding folks to the highest standard at that point. So I thank you, Sydney, for your question, or Cindy for your question, and I regret that I've disappointed you. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Congressman. We're going to move to Nancy Erdley next. So if Nancy could get ready to unmute herself and to turn on her camera, we'll have her ask the next question for you. So welcome, Nancy, to the telephone town or the town hall.
We don't have you yet, Nancy. I think you need to activate your, okay, I think we have you on video now, and I think we also have an audio. There we go.
Okay. Just going beyond, I had several questions that I put up, but what I would like to know is that for all the amount of times you've said that the allegations about a stolen election were false, the fact is the court never actually looked at the evidence. And so I would like you to address the fact that you can continually state that it was not a stolen election on that basis. And I will echo Cindy's comment that I could not have been more disappointed. We thought that we lived with 10 years of Representative Amash betraying us, and you did it in 2 weeks. And so I don't know that there's really much you can say that will ever change my mind and not work toward primarying you out after 2 years. But nevertheless, appreciate the opportunity to ask that question, but the evidence was never reviewed. And I'd like to hear what you think about that.
Absolutely. So thank you for that point. And obviously from November 3rd onwards, there were multiple investigations. There were multiple court cases that were raised. I think the president's reelection campaign ultimately brought over 60 cases to court. Of those, I think it was 61. Of those 60 some were dismissed on merit, but to your point, many were dismissed on a lack of standing. There have been challenges, and let's be very clear for one thing I forgot to mention earlier. Those who were challenging the Electoral College certification results on the floor of the House, their argument was not that it was a stolen election. The argument was that there were non-legislative modifications to the electoral process in several states, and that under an interpretation of Article 2, Section 1, Clause 3 of the Constitution, combined with, a question around the constitutionality of the Electoral Count Act of 1887, opened up a window to question the overall constitutionality of those modifications. So it was a very narrow argument. This was what was discussed in the amicus brief that was filed in Texas, with many members of Congress on the Republican side signing on in December. I believe it was the first or second week of December. So that was the argument being made federally. That was also the argument that was being made in many of the court cases. The question, and this is where I spent a lot of time looking into, screenshots that were being, shared around in the weeks after the election, trying to track down some allegations. Some you could figure out. Okay, here's where there was maybe a difference of opinion or process. Here was where we failed to find where ultimately that statistic came from. The DePorno report, I think it was from Antrim County, about the Dominion tabulators up there, and then also the Immaculate Deception, I believe, report by Peter Navarro. I read those. I looked into many of the allegations. I struggled to substantiate anything, as did Georgia Bureau of Investigations election investigation in terms of that state's elections, as did the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice. President Trump's Attorney General, Bill Barr, said there was no evidence for widespread fraud in that election. Now, when I talk about the need for an electoral integrity commission, it's because there were issues that were raised. But this is where I'm very clear in terms of distinguishing between where were there process failures, where was maybe there an opportunity for fraud, and partially because of the expanded use of absentee ballots, we didn't have the oversight that we would have in a normal time to root that out. Setting aside what would have maybe impacted a few votes in a few places, in order to have a widespread landslide theft of an election, you would need to find enough evidence in enough states that would have at least changed that state's outcome. And then you would have needed to replicate that in multiple places. And that's where the evidence did not bear itself out. And again, the question on the lack of standing as a reason why many of these court cases were thrown out, I can't speak to the competence of the lawyers that those campaigns hired, but just because you don't know how to formulate an argument at the court level, just because they weren't able to actually, follow that process does not mean, and frankly, to me, further undermines that they may have had a legitimate argument to make underneath. And when it comes to what was being argued at the federal level on the House floor, many of those issues were addressed by courts when it comes to process modifications, were addressed by courts leading up to the November election. Some of you may remember, and I was living it very closely, and it was incredibly frustrating, that a court had ordered that Michigan extend the deadline to receive absentee ballots by 2 weeks, as long as it had been postmarked by the day before. Thankfully, I believe it was Michigan Republican Party lawyers challenged that, and we got that changed back to receipt by election night. But that's how you argue, or how we should be arguing issues around electoral process. So that's where I think we have to set aside the arguments that were being made on process and those alleging widespread fraud. And at the end of the day, fraud significant enough to change state level results, let alone presidential level, has not been established. Thank you, Nancy. We'll go to the next question.
Okay, Kim Reeder. Kim, if you could get ready to unmute yourself and turn on your camera, you will be able to ask your question for Congressman Meijer. So Kim, welcome to the town hall meeting. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay.
I can hear you, Kim.
Oh, there I am.
I can see you, Kim.
Hello, Representative Peter Meijer. I just wanted to let you know one thing. I am super proud of you for following your conscience. I know that must have been a really hard decision. I know what you're facing back here in GR. It's quite a cesspool right now, with all the different opinions, etc. But I just wanted to let you know that I think you did the right thing. I'm proud of you. I didn't vote for you, but right now I'm sure glad you're my representative, and I just wanted to let you know that you're doing a good job. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. I appreciate that. Did you have a question? I really am grateful for your words.
Yes. No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be like that. Yes, I do have a question. Where do you see the future of the Republican Party after redistricting here in M13 or M3?
That's a very good question. So this year, we have both redistricting, which means we redraw the lines, and also reapportionment, which means that we change the number of representatives we have. That's every 10 years after a census, they review, and there's a couple of complex formulations to figure out how many members of Congress are allotted per state. while Michigan has been growing, we've been growing more slowly than other states. So unfortunately, we currently have 14 members of Congress. We will go down to 13. And this is also the first year that we have shifted from the state legislature redrawing those lines, the redistricting, to an independent redistricting commission doing that. So to answer your question, that's something that we're closely looking at. I am monitoring a GOP conference meeting among the House that we're having tonight, that I left and hope that my proxy vote with a colleague will be sufficient. But I think in terms of the future of the Republican Party, I think we have a lot of work to do. Thank you, Kim.
Okay, we're going to go to Taylor Rabidia next. I believe that's how you spell or pronounce her last name. She's calling from Grand Rapids. So Taylor, if you can get ready to unmute yourself and have your video go live, you can ask your question for Congressman Meijer. Welcome, Taylor.
Hi.
Hi, Taylor.
Let me see. I had a question here and I got to pull it back up.
And are we pronouncing your last name correctly, Taylor?
It's Robita, but you know, it gets mispronounced all the time. Not a big deal. Yeah, so let's see. I had 3 questions here, but my big question is COVID relief plan. The Senate Republicans had a rebuttal to the president's plan that included a $1,000 stimulus check to those making $50K or less, which, you know, it's great for people here in Michigan, but I'm concerned with those folks in higher cost of living areas where that may not be sufficient. Do you agree with that change? And then also, what would it take, what other changes would it take in the plan for you to vote for it?
Oh, thank you for that, Taylor. So on the COVID relief, and we're actually just having discussions today to try to bring forward a standalone bill that focuses on, and this is saying we want to debate some of those other components, but bring forward a standalone bill solely on vaccine production, distribution, administration, and testing. Under the $1.9 trillion plan that the Biden administration laid out, they allocated $20 billion for vaccines and $50 billion for testing. Again, 1.9 trillion, and we're spending $20 billion on vaccines. The way we end this pandemic, how we get through this, is by stopping the spread, slowing the spread. And the only effective way to do that right now and to protect the most vulnerable is by, massive expansion of our current vaccine distribution. Now, when the Biden administration took over from the Trump administration, Operation Warp Speed, which had been a fantastic success in terms of developing a vaccine in record time, they had already been on a pathway to over 1 million vaccines a day. I've been talking with folks at multiple steps in that chain to see what we can do to make that more rapid, because that is a strong priority. And that's still something we're trying to figure out what we can, where the bottlenecks are and where those limiting coefficients are. Because I know in Grand Rapids at DeVos Place, Spectrum can vaccinate up to 30,000 people a day, and they're getting 5,000 vaccines a week, and that's unacceptable. I support direct cash payments. I think one of my frustrations, and this is why I'm setting aside the vaccination and the testing components and the other parts of that relief package, is because there's a lot of elements that are being proposed, specifically $250 billion in municipal and state relief, that I am very skeptical is being allocated in a targeted, appropriate way. My concern with state level relief and city relief has been that if it's not done on a per capita basis, it risks rewarding states and municipalities that have been mismanaging their finance going into this pandemic. They're obviously going to be hit exceptionally hard, but at the end of the day, it becomes cities and states that have managed their finances well who are shouldering the burden for those who haven't. So if you're going to do that, do it on a per capita basis, spread it out as it pertains to that population of an area, rather than other metrics that are being used. I'm hopeful that the direct cash payments, especially to folks who are left between existing programs, I'm hopeful that will that will be something that can be distributed soon, because the two things we need to do to get through this and be better off on the other end is the vaccination administration I was talking about, and then making sure that especially for our hardest hit communities and Americans, and also for our small businesses, that they have the economic relief they need to be able to get through to the other side. Thank you, Taylor.
All right. Our next question is from John D. I don't have a last name there. So John D, if you could get ready to unmute yourself and to turn your camera on, we'd appreciate it. And just a reminder, if you are submitting a question and we don't have your full name in your screen name, please include that in the Q&A comment box so that we can address you properly. So welcome, John.
Hi there.
Hi, John.
Yeah, I clicked on my mobile phone, and it didn't even give me an option to put a name or anything in. So and then I got brought up as a panelist and got all these new options. So had a couple questions. First, I'm glad to see that you signed on. You're part of the Problem Solvers caucus, and I want to know what's on the Problem Solvers caucus agenda. What do you think are bipartisan issues that are actually going to get any sort of traction? Obviously, we're incredibly hyper-partisan times. And then second question, student loans are a huge growing crisis. I have a lot out in student loans currently. Was wondering if you were on board with the Biden plan to reform the public service loan forgiveness program. Currently that program that would forgive loans for people that go into public service or work for nonprofits and might forego higher salaries than the private sector, has a 1% completion rate because the requirements are so stringent. Mm-hmm. And hopefully you might be able to get on board with reforming that so that people can actually make use of that program and encourage people to go into public service like yourself.
Well, thank you, John. Two great questions, or two great areas to address. One, on the Problem Solvers Caucus. I'm really hopeful that, in the short term, the COVID relief is something that we can continue to, or that we can engage in a bipartisan manner. Again, the challenge with what we've been seeing with the use of the budget reconciliation is that not a single vote on the other side of the aisle is required. So there's no incentive to compromise. There's no incentive to negotiate. There's no incentive to have that be something where my input as a member of the minority party is at all accepted. So areas where I think we can find some good compromise in areas for bipartisan agreement on national security when it comes to China and the threat that they pose, and elements of our critical supply chain, and getting back our domestic manufacturing. I think we can have some very strong bipartisan agreement there. Within the Michigan delegation, we have strong bipartisan agreement, as evidenced with the PFAS task force, and protecting our environment and protecting our Great Lakes. The idea, and this was really exposed due to COVID and in China's rise more broadly, the idea that we need to bring back some of our critical supply chain industries, whether that's pharmaceutical manufacturing, personal protective equipment manufacturing, higher end technological items. GM just put out an alert today that they're concerned about a semiconductor chip shortage with the production of their increasingly electronic and autonomous vehicles. That's something that we've been working with other Michigan congressional offices on. That's something where Democrats and Republicans can look at the same issue and say, this is a problem we need to solve. We need to make sure that we have strong cybersecurity requirements and that we're in a good position to be driving forward on domestic resiliency and supply chain strength. Those are areas that, again, you look at the problem, you address it, you understand what needs to be done, and it doesn't matter if there's an R or D next to your name. You want to make sure what's being done is best for the country as a whole. So I'm optimistic on those fronts. You talked about the student loan kind of forgiveness and some of the incentive programs around public service. I'm very supportive about looking into what we can do to make those programs better. I know in the military, there's a student loan repayment program that offers a strong incentive to join the service for those who have higher student loan debt burdens. I'm optimistic that we can review some of the current limitations of that program, but I also want to make sure that we're not having taxpayer dollars be abused by having an overly wide mandate. So I've spent a significant amount of my life in some form of service or another, whether it was in the military, with the Army in Iraq, or in humanitarian aid domestically and abroad in disaster response. That's something that I think is important, and what we can do to incentivize the next generation and those who've already completed college to pursue those careers, I think would be an important tool. Thank you. The next question.
All right, great. We're going to move to Melissa Stark next. So Melissa, if you could get ready to unmute yourself and turn your camera on. We'd like to have you ask your question for Congressman Meijer. So Melissa, welcome.
Hi, it's me and my husband here.
Hi, Melissa. And what's your husband's name?
Jason.
Jason, sorry.
Hi, Melissa and Jason.
So I'm just interested in what you can offer us and what you know about, PBMs, and my husband can talk more on that right now.
Yeah, as far as
Pharmacy benefit managers.
yeah, pharmacy benefit managers. I'm a pharmacist, so I kind of see the abuse on this level a lot. And it's a venue that a lot of the public doesn't know anything about. They might look at their insurance card and see, okay, this is Express Scripts. And kind of from my point of view, what I see is the rising costs they cause to our healthcare. And I always hear politicians speak about lowering drug prices as the way to getting our healthcare, cost cheaper, lower prescription prices, but never addressing the root cause of these pharmacy benefit managers that, as I said in my question, how they're, caused 40% of independent pharmacies to close across the country in the last 5 years. And, this is affecting small businesses, and it's a organization that can operate in almost complete secrecy without the public knowing that why their prescription meds are costing so much, the healthcare plans not knowing why they're being charged so much, and just general from a business, from my profession, we can see it, the amount of money that they're, costing people, and they're taking away from, pharmacies. Just wondered if you had any insight into that, or if you had kind of looked into that at all.
So that is a great question, and I'm hesitant to go too far down the healthcare side, just because we could be here all night. It's such an incredibly complex issue, but you also hit the nail on the head with the role of pharmacy benefit managers. And I know especially there have been the issues around rebate clawbacks. Instead of being able to pass those on to the customer or the consumer or the patient, having those go back up the chain. This is where we have to consider, net price rather than list price. You can have, and there have been some companies trying to do this as well, you can have wildly different costs where, the more you have a black box and not understanding how that ultimate cost is derived, and frankly, with the blend of insured individuals and what degree their insurance is going to cover their pharmaceuticals, and some whose aren't covered. I was talking, this is a little bit of an aside, but I was talking with several constituents on Monday who are members of the American Diabetes Association around the cost of insulin and how that has increased significantly just in the past couple of years. The Trump administration actually implemented a rule to try to stem some of that cost increase. The Biden administration put a hold on it, which is usually a traditional mechanism. I hope they continue it on. But the overall growth of prescription pharmaceutical costs and the way that that price delta ends up just being obscured, right? When we have less transparency in every part of the pricing system, when we have fewer components that are ultimately subject to scrutiny, when we have rebates, but those rebates aren't passed down to the customer, when there are generics and those generics aren't able to be offered as a substitute, sometimes due to confidentiality agreements or exclusive distribution agreements, all of that is going to end up raising those costs at the end of the day. So when we talk about what can the Problem Solvers Caucus do, frankly, this is a great example. I know we'll be looking at insulin prices, and frankly, pharmaceutical pricing more broadly, and elements of that chain are important for us to visit. and I hope we can address that soon. I know obviously we've been dealing with a constitutional crisis, inauguration, and a pandemic all simultaneous, but this is an important thing for Congress to address, and I'm right there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Jason and Melissa. We are going to move now to Jack Carlson. So Jack, if you could get ready to unmute yourself and turn on your camera, we're going to have you go live and ask your question for Congressman Meijer. So Mr. Carlson, welcome to the town hall.
Yes, Congressman Meijer, thanks for taking the question. Thanks for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you, Jack.
I'll be real specific. It won't take much time, but my question concerns HR 127, which, as we know, the current administration and probably more of the progressive movement is looking hard at limiting our gun abilities, our Second Amendment. HR 127 states that part of it is, one, we have to show where we store our weapons, how we store our weapons, and then the access the armed forces could have to knowing, excuse me, where those weapons are at. So just, I'd like to hear your side of that.
Yeah, let me say I haven't HR 127. I don't believe it's been introduced yet in this Congress, and so I don't want to speak on the particulars. But let me address what you're talking about, and we have a Second Amendment for a reason. It doesn't seem like any of those components at all comply with the Second Amendment. There is a Second Amendment caucus here on the Hill, which I am joining, though joining is a little bit vague because they don't have a registry. A bit of a joke. But I think in general, while I support a firearms culture of safety and responsibility, when you have proposals that would be just frankly gross violations of individual liberties, it's just a non-starter, and could never be something I could support. I don't know how it could be found constitutional within the current framework of the Second Amendment. It would be something I would vigorously oppose. Thank you, Jack.
All right, and Congressman, I know that you've got to get back to the meeting that you have going, and we already have hit the end of our time for today. So unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it up for right now, and we still have a lot of questions that we unfortunately did not get to. So apologize to everybody who's in the queue yet, but Congressman, if you've got any final comments, please feel free.
I will, Rick, and thank you everyone for joining. We plan on doing these. I don't want to tell or put too much talk on the staff, but they did a fantastic job working through this. I believe we were actually one of the first staffs to work out this Zoom town hall arrangement with Facebook live streaming. I think it's an important thing for us to be doing, especially in this COVID era, and I want to do it far more frequently. So we will plan on holding at least one per month, if not multiple per month, so we can continue to inform folks in the district, and again, continue to answer questions as they come up, but also providing updates on where we're going and where we see opportunities to move the ball forward for West Michigan and for the country. So thank you to everyone who's joining us tonight. I hope you have a wonderful evening, and I'm grateful that you've taken the time to reach out and to watch. Thank you all.